Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Sustainable Backyards Run Tauranga 2022 event, bird calls, knowing your bird calls. That annoying bird call that is annoying you in the mornings at 4 a.m. My name is Paul Cumming. I'm a Western Bay Wildlife Trust member and Birds New Zealand regional representative for Tauranga and the Volcanic Plateau. I've spent most of my life listening for birds. So what birds that are stumping me at the moment are a few, and they're usually just newer arrivals. They're not native birds. However, the native birds are much more important than the imported birds. So I'm going to focus on some of those native birds today. And namely the tui. The tui is actually quite a mimic. So it does have quite a lot of calls that are purloined or stolen from other birds' songs. So we'll get into it and show you exactly how you can tell one from the other. So we'll just go straight into the first slide and have a look and see. So I've named this slide Tui and their imitators, mainly because the birds themselves are actually being imitated by the tui. So it's just a reversal of what it says there. So the main thing about the tui is it has two voice boxes or syrinxes, and that means that it can make two different types of sounds all at once. And that is a very rare thing to have for a bird. So the tui itself is up there in terms of the sort of like the believe it or not sort of bird of the world, having two voice boxes. So it sounds quite, I'll play you the standard sound, then I can play you some other sounds. So the first sound is the standard one. So that is actually the standard tui sound, and it has a little bit of an element of a bellbird call in there. So we'll play the bellbird call for you right now. So as you can see, those birds are pretty similar in their calls, but the bellbird has definitely got a clearer call. It has less of the sort of sound to it, and you've got quite a lot of clear separate notes, whereas the tui can run all of their notes together. So just a note on the photographs that you're seeing, the good ones are from New Zealand Birds Online, and the rest of the really rough ones are my own. To the right of the bellbird photo is a juvenile bellbird. So that might look like quite a lot of other birds in the forest, so just be careful of that. I'll just play you the songs that will definitely separate out tui and bellbird for you, and that is the alarm calls. So the alarm calls for the tui is quite distinctive, and I'll just play you that. So that's quite a distinctive call, but if you have a bellbird doing the same sort of call, alarm call, so those two are pretty distinctive, and so you will definitely know you've got one or the other. I'm just going to play you the pinnacle of bird song in New Zealand, and it is the kukau call. You may not hear this in your backyard, but I thought I'd better put that in. So you can hear a little bit of a twinkle in the background, and if the people that have come from Europe are onto it, you'll find that that is a goldfinch call. So the calls of the kokako are many and varied. So we'll just move on. And some of the time, the kokako is also imitating the kaka, and the other way around. The tui also imitates the kaka. So you'll get tui at various times of the year, mainly in autumn time, and they are ranging up and down the Kaimai Ranges. They come across from Tuhua, Mere Island. So we'll go into the smaller birds that you can see in the forest and in the forest edges and in your gardens at times. So we'll play the bird that has the loudest call for its size in New Zealand. And if this bird was the size of a white-faced heron, you'd all be deaf. So that's the riro riro, or grey warbler. That is a small bush bird, and it comes into the gardens at various times of the year, mainly springtime. And it is parasitized by the shining cuckoo. So we'll show you what the cuckoo sounds like soon. The other bird, small bird that looks a little like the grey warbler, is a silver eye or wax eye or toho, and that sounds like this. Black swan in the background. So they'll be coming into the garden soon when the forest flowers start not flowering. The bird that's most commonly in the gardens that is a native bird is actually the fantail. So the Māori name for that is the piwakawaka, and it is also used in various advertising at the moment for forest fire risk. So it's a well-known bird. For the birds that are not as well known, but you might be living on the bush edges, we've got two, and they are both distantly related. One of them is the miro or tomtit. And the other one is a tutawai or robin. So those birds are mostly, the last two, more into the deeper forest, but do come down to the margins, and certainly in the Henderson tramline track in the Kaimai, you can certainly see and hear both of those birds. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're getting a slightly bigger birds now, but the one that we've got up the top here, the two that we've got up the top are parasites. Now the parasites are the cuckoos. Cuckoos lay in other birds' nests, so they're not necessarily the welcome thing for the other birds, but our birds have negated the fact that they can't breed at all by breeding before these cuckoos arrive in New Zealand. Both the cuckoos arrive in New Zealand from the Solomon Islands, north of Australia, and Papua New Guinea. So the birds in New Zealand have got a break before they get their nests laden by these cuckoos. So the long-tailed cuckoo is the whitehead's nest. The whitehead is below the photo of the long-tailed cuckoo. The whitehead gets parasitized by the long-tailed cuckoo. I'm just going to play the long-tailed cuckoo. If you're up next to the long-tailed cuckoo, you'll also get deafened. So that sometimes gets confused with the greenfinch because they've got similar calls, but the long-tailed cuckoo has a sh sound, whereas the greenfinch has a sh call, opposite. The shining cuckoo is probably one of the most distinctive bird songs in New Zealand. I'll play that. So that's the sign of spring for New Zealanders mainly, and in October, September, October, these birds will be starting to call. They parasitize the grey warbler nests. The last bird we'll better play the whitehead's song, which is a bird of more of a dense forest, so you'll need to be walking in the forest. Apart from if you're in Kawerau, and sometimes they'll come down to the bird feeders in Kawerau because the forest is quite close to that town. So a little tip to get the whiteheads closer so you can identify them a little bit further is to imitate their call. And it's easy for us to imitate their call just by going psh, 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 psh. That's all you need to do, and those birds will come down. They even come down during the autumn time, like this time of the year. I tried that last week. And the kiraroo, and New Zealand wood pigeon, is hardly heard at all, apart from when it flies away, but it does have a call of its own. I'll play you that. So that's quite a different call. So when you hear that, just be thankful you've actually heard. They don't always call like that. They're mostly silent. So we'll go on to the next slide, which is small parrots. There's a bit of a mixed bag of parrots in New Zealand. The native ones that you hardly ever see, and the introduced ones or escaped cage birds you see all the time. So we'll start with the ones that you hardly ever see. You need to be in the Puriora forest or very, very large tracts like Whirinaki of the Urewera forest to be, or on Tirimatangi Island to see these. Kakariki is the bird. That's the Māori name for the colour green as well. So as you can see, it's mostly green. But sometimes the rosella is confused with the kakariki, mainly because when it's flying away from you, which is about the commonest view you can see of a rosella, there is a proliferance of green on the back of it. Now these are escaped from the cage, which is a small picture, bottom right of the screen. It's got an eastern rosella in New Zealand in its preferred habitat. Not necessarily the most welcome of birds, especially for horticulturalists. So these birds have also got a single call, very high-pitched whistle, very one note. So that's pretty much it. So we'll go on to the next slide. More small native birds. Oh, goodness. Well, okay, we'll start off with one that you can usually see in the rural areas and in the harbour edges. And they nest under small structures and sometimes in unwelcome doorways. So you might hear that quite often but sometimes I'll just do the first little 2 cheeps of that call. The Māori name is Waro, but it has only been here since the 1950s, that one, under its own steam, so it's regarded as a native bird. And the bird that's been here all along, ultra rare now, but you can see it up the Ongatete Forest Project, is Titipunamu or Rifleman. And this has got the highest pitched call of all New Zealand birds. So if you're about 70 or above, your hearing and your pitch comes down. You can't hear that bird. It's time before you're 70 to go and see this bird and hear it. It's very high pitched, as I say. Now, the kingfisher or kotare is also South Pacific wide, like the swallow, and it has various calls, but the main call is this one. So that's the main call. It's actually a very good indicator that there's going to be a little bit of rain or shower activity for the rest of the day. So it's actually a bit more of a weather predictor than the grey warbler singing. But the other call that kingfisher does is quite different. I'll show you that. So that's a very aggressive kingfisher call. So that's probably heard quite commonly, and you just don't know what it is. So that's it, an angry kingfisher. So the bird on the bottom of the slide is a fern bird, and you can find these by walking around the Daisy Hardwick Walk, Waikario Estuary, or in the Carmichael, Tauranga wetlands there, and just waiting. The birds are curious. They're called a fernbird or matata. So that's a secretive bird that you might find if you're patient enough. So if you're lying in bed at night like me, awake, wondering what on earth to do at work the following morning, you might hear some birds calling. Now, mainly this will be commuting shorebirds, because the shorebirds just make use of the tides, and whatever tide that comes and goes, it doesn't really matter what time of the day or night, and they'll start feeding. So it's totally tide dependent. So I've got a selection of shorebirds here for you, but I'll start off with the obvious night caller, and that's our native owl or morepork or ruru, and it has 4 different calls. So I'll try for 2 of them. Now, that wasn't what you were expecting, was it? Well, that is actually what's called a mew call, and that is often mistaken as a kiwi, but it is the morepork, and it's just at the beginning time of the evening. So it's almost like it's a warm-up call. And this one. Well, that's your normal morepork call. That's why it's called a morepork. Sounds just like that word. So those the other 2 calls the morepork do are quite unusual, but one of them sounds just like I've been talking too much. Yeah, that sounds about right. I'll just go and just play you brief calls of things that are going to be flying over at night. The spurwing plover, which is a bit of a pain for farmers. That's a typical wetland bird that will fly to and from the harbour edges overnight. So poaka, pied stilt, that will that'll be almost in the same sort of vein as the spurwing plover. Spurwing plover's got no Maori name because it's only been here since the 70s, breeding since the 70s. It's an Australian bird. This is Toria, pied oystercatcher. So those birds and that oystercatcher sometimes is a different species, which is all black, called the variable oystercatcher. It has exactly the same call. You won't be able to identify them at night. But the Māori name for black oystercatcher is Toria Pango. So next slide is something that I sort of try and skip over, so because it's so confusing, these birds. They all look like sparrows to some extent, whether you're looking at them in a shadowy situation in the bush or out on the lawn. But there's a couple of ones that we can identify pretty quickly by their calls, and one of them I'll start off with is the skylark. So that doesn't sound like a sparrow at all. And that bird is usually doing that call when it's at least 30 or 40 meters up in the sky. So that's why the skylark is called that. And it is an English import, no Māori name. The pipit is also South Pacific, and the skylark is rough country next to a pasture. That's it. Pipit is the same and more beach sort of bird and high tops of the alpine regions.
Track 59. Oh. The New Zealand pipit or pi hoi hoi.
So this is quite a long call, so I'll talk over the last bit of it. The pipit itself is quite an unusual bird to have in the Bay of Plenty. You do see them down the end of Popamore Beach, and you can also see them at the top of the lower Kaimai area in the Henderson tramline track area. They wag their tails, so that's their identifying feature. And they don't fly, sing and fly. So those two birds that I've got up there on the screen are quite similar looking, but their behavior separates them out. So the redpoll looks like a sparrow that's had a hard night on the red wine, but it has quite an interesting call. I'll show you this. So in the background was not a redpoll, but the main call was the redpoll. In the background was Californian quail. Those are birds of open country, so you will see them in the pastures and on the edges of the urban areas. So the dunnock is also an import. These have got no Māori names, but it's not related to the sparrow, even though its other name is hedge sparrow, but the dunnock has got a very distinctive lifestyle apart from the sparrow. So that's the squeaky wheel call of the dunnock, and that's quite a distinctive call, and no other birds do that call. So you'll know you've got a dunnock in your backyard if you have that call, but it does have a nice little better call in the breeding time, and this is it. So it's a nice little twinkly call there, and that's its song. So there's two different parts of a bird call, one of its call and one of its song, and that's a good demonstration there. So the chaffinch is our most common bird in the bush edges, and they also inhabit quite far into the forest and into the urban environment. magpie in the background. So that's one of our most common birds. The thing about the chaffinch is that it has about 3 different types of call, and that's the most common one. Now the yellowhammer is down the bottom here in the middle. That has got quite an interesting call, and it's been translated into English, which is really good. And it is a little bit of bread and no cheese. You get that? A little bit of bread and no cheese. Well, at least you'll be able to remember that. Yellowhammer. It's an introduced bird from Europe. Also introduced is the goldfinch, and it has an interesting, distinctive tinkly type call. So that's the goldfinch, and the last finch is the greenfinch, which back a few slides I said was the opposite of the long-tailed cuckoo. And the other call is the flight call of greenfinch, and you can hear that right now over Tauranga skies. That's pretty common at the moment. So the medium-sized European imports, except BMWs. It's 2 buttons too far. Okay, so these are pretty much the common species you'll find in your garden. These are the birds that will make use of all sorts of things in the urban environment, but you can also find them on the farmlands. So the blackbird here has got a couple of calls, and sounds just like the song thrush, and I'll be able to tell you which one's which. So that's the blackbird call. Now you'll notice that none of those notes were repeated. And if you look at the song thrush, repeat. Repeat. So that's the difference. If you hear a song that's got no repeated notes, you've got a blackbird. If you hear a song that's got all the repeated notes, song thrush. The other call that the blackbird does is also distinctive, and it's the alarm call. Yeah, obviously recorded on a farm, that one. So the starling is also quite a good mimic. It will mimic spurling plover type calls. It will mimic anything that it will hear in its course of its life. And I'll play you the call that it's normally associated with. So that's quite a series of calls, and that's why if you raise a starling from its egg, you can teach it a number of words and sounds. The other photos that you've got there are on the right is the winter plumage of the starling, which looks totally different to the summer on the left. And at the bottom is a young starling, which confuses even quite experienced birders. World imports. Okay, well, we've got a few of these now, and some of them are becoming very common. Along Papamoa Beach Road, we have a lot of pheasants, and they sound like this. So those were imported as game birds. That means that people could shoot them, and they have escaped in numbers and have escaped the guns. The magpie was brought in from Australia to combat our bug issues in the farms. They're obviously quite common, and you can hear them from pretty early on in the morning. And the other thing is that they don't like you being anywhere near their nest, so you'll get a short shift out of there. This is the most common dove now in the Bay of Plenty. So that's the Malay spotted dove, or just spotted dove, and as its name suggests, it's from Southeast Asia. However, it's an escaped cage bird. Also escaping the cage is the Barbary dove, or the turtle dove. So the reason why they're escaped the cages is probably owners have let them out to stretch their wings and they haven't turned and come back. So I guess that's called an escaped cage bird. And another bird that was introduced from Asia is the myna, and it is one of the most common birds of all. So the myna and the magpie together have been introduced to control our bugs, but they also control a lot of other animals, including other birds. So, nothing kills them except for speeding cars. So I don't advise you to do that. Sounds like Chicago, right? Well, that's the California quail. So the California quail was introduced like the pheasant for shooting and has escaped, of course, and is seen in rough pastures and sometimes in backyards, but mainly in exotic forests and forest blocks like the Tecked All-Terrain Park. So the birds of prey are few and far between in New Zealand. We've only got a couple of native ones. And the top one here is Australian, and it has introduced itself, and it's called the harrier or the hawk, kahu, Māori name. So that's quite a distinctive call, and they do that in flight. Distinction between the harrier and the bird below, the New Zealand falcon, or kariaria, is that the harrier circles lazily doing that call, and the falcon, if you see it, straight flight, very fast, and calling at the same time. So the New Zealand falcon, or kariarea, is actually living locally. It nests up the back of Welcome Bay, visits Moao. It is often seen, but only, it's not a common bird. Let's just say that. So if you're living near wetlands or wet fields or stream sides, you will find that these birds in this screen here are quite common, but sometimes you wouldn't know what they sounded like. So here's the white-faced heron. They always sound like they've got a headache, hard night. Those are probably the most common shorebird in all habitats. Pukeko are quite common, very common in very small bits of habitat. The ability for the heron to fly everywhere is the key there. Good news about the pukeko is that they have the ability to use tools to feed. So they'll hold little sticks in their feet and use those sticks to assist them in getting food. However, the bad news about pukeko is they have no road sense. So unfortunately, that's where you see a lot of them. So we're going to go and have a look at a banded rail now. Moro Pereirahu, I think is the Māori name. It's a rare bird, but if you're patient enough in the Carmichael Reserve, you can see them, and they're out near the edge of the Carmichael Reserve, away from a lot of the people. So take a dead end track and just sit down on a receding tide and have a look, and it's just like that on the screen. They'll just be darting in and out of the undercover. Well, I won't worry too much about that. So at this point in time, those are all your birds. And I just wanted to tell you what we do as an organisation, the revegetation and cleanups we do through Western Bay Wildlife Trust. We also educate and involve children and adults around our areas where we study the birds. Penguins and the petrels are mainly the birds we study. Science and research of that is that we are conducting mortality research and chick banding. And we also operate a penguin rescue service, 0800 Sick Penguin. So the books that you would probably want to have on board if you wanted to learn anything further are those two bird books. You can find those at the library if you don't want to pay money for those. But the ultimate resource is New Zealand Birds Online, and the key is that these are peer-reviewed articles on birds, and it also has bird calls and photographs, including the egg and the nest, and the bird calls down the bottom of the site of the slide here. So you can listen to what I've been showing you this evening, and that I think is the last slide. And thanks for all your questions afterwards. Hopefully we'll get some questions, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them for you. So thanks for your time this evening, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.